constituents, there seem to be no hidden or extra dimensions in the universe, there seem to be no dark matter particles discovered in any of the collisions, and there were no axion-like particles or quantum black holes. And so here, by analyzing these very specific angles following collisions, researchers definitively showed us that we can test a lot of physical concepts by just looking at some of this older data. Which means that we'll come back and discuss additional data and additional discoveries in some of the future videos. On that note, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM it directly, or by joining channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.
An ally has been slain.
Give me your best. Hit me like you mean it.
An enemy has been slain.
Some say I'm battle-hardened. Hardly.
An ally has been slain. An ally has been slain.
I'll test their mettle against my fire. Come here!
An ally has been slain.
Well, the end of the world isn't gonna stop itself. Gotta go. Ha! Still trying to sell me an actual weapon.
Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some of the recent discoveries in regards to the origins of complex life on planet Earth, and specifically a major breakthrough coming from Australia in helping us understand how pretty much everything around us, including me and you, potentially began. And that's because, based on some of the research from the last few decades, a lot of biologists believe that complex life very likely arose as a result of a kind of a symbiosis between bacteria and other complex cells. But the problem was that this was mostly a theory or a hypothesis, and there was always a kind of a missing link between simple bacteria and much more complex cells, such as eukaryotic cells, that all of us are made out of. And so biologists have never actually seen this in action until basically extremely recently. And so to find some of these answers, we actually have to travel to a location that most of us have probably never heard of. The location in Western Australia that's actually a World Heritage Site. This is known as Gathagoodoo, a location off the coast of Western Australia that's also sometimes referred to as the Shark Bay. And here this place is very important for one very specific structure that's actually extremely rare on our planet. This location is home to stromatolites, layered mounds of microbial life that basically resemble rocks but are actually living relics of ecosystem from billions of years ago. And though these have been discovered in other locations like near Saudi Arabia, the study about which we've discussed in one of the videos in the description, normally these are actually kind of rare, but are super important for understanding the evolution of complex life. And in essence, these are microbial mats, or basically a collection of different microbes living together, forming these enormous communities. And they're also oxygen factories. In fact, some of the first bubbles of oxygen that filled Earth's early atmosphere most likely came from the ancestors of very similar structures. So in some sense, you could say that we owe our existence to a lot of these somewhat strange-looking rocks. But the most recent discovery is not really about oxygen or how these microbes breathe, but about genealogy of our greatest microbial ancestor, the genealogy of so-called archaea. Technically, these are not bacteria and not eukaryotic cells, but are something slightly different and possibly something in between. But to understand this research and why it's so important, let's briefly talk about our cells, eukaryotes. And so here, all plants, animals, fungi, and a lot of single-cell organisms we usually find in ponds are what's known as eukaryotes. Basically, our cells have complex parts, including nucleus and mitochondria, and a lot of structures that bacteria do not possess. And for many decades, the explanation for this was the idea known as endosymbiosis, or symbiogenesis. Basically, 2 billion years ago, some kind of a simple bacteria possibly joined with some kind of an archaea, merging into a single cell and becoming a kind of a proto-eukaryote. And so basically, instead of eating the bacteria, the archaea formed a partnership with it, with the bacterium eventually becoming our mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell that provides a lot of energy, but also seems to control our bodies in a lot of other ways. You can learn about this in one of the videos in the description. And so not so long ago, less than a decade ago, completely by accident, researchers discovered a potential host of this initial relationship. That's the Asgard archaea you see right here. And a lot of these microbes were actually named after the Norse gods, such as Loki, Odin, and Thor, mostly because they were discovered near a hydrothermal vent referred to as the Loki's Castle. It's actually very close to Norway, so essentially naming in this case made a lot of sense. And what makes them special is that they do carry a lot of eukaryotic signature proteins and a lot of additional genes that bacteria do not have, but our cells seem to contain as well. And so, for example, proteins for moving the cell membranes and transporting materials that we once thought only complex cells could do. But while scientists have known about these Asgard archaea for at least a few years now, they essentially are just a little bit too difficult to study in the lab. Mostly because they grow incredibly slowly and usually depend on other organisms for survival. Which basically means that a lot of this was still somewhat hypothetical, and there was no actual evidence that any of this could have happened. And so this is where the team of researchers, including the associate professor Brennan Burns, decided to focus on. They spent 5 years nurturing these microbes and essentially tried to grow them inside the lab based on the samples collected from the Shark Bay. In other words, they tried to recreate all of this in lab conditions in order to find some kind of an evidence for this endosymbiosis hypothesis. And in this new study published in April of 2026, they have now revealed that they were able to successfully enrich a novel species of Asgard archaeon that you can kind of see in this picture. They also named this, okay, let me try this, this is going to be a tough one, Neriarchaeum marumarumaye, with the word marumarumaye coming from the local tribal language that basically means ancient home, which basically is what they're trying to recreate here. They're trying to recreate the ancient home of complex life. And so this is where things get a little bit interesting. Here, by using extremely sensitive 3D imaging techniques, something referred to as electron cryotomography, scientists were able to witness something we've never seen before: the first contact between an Asgard archaeon and a bacterium. And specifically, these images show us that the two organisms were physically interacting through very tiny thread-like structures referred to as nanotubes. In other words, here we have the first ever evidence for an actual symbiosis between archaea, and specifically Asgard archaea, and bacteria. But here these microbes were not just touching, they were cooperating. And that's because here, by using genetic sequencing, scientists determined that they seem to be sharing nutrients, including vitamins. Specifically here, the archaea produced things that bacterium needed, and the bacterium returned the favor, which directly reflects the hypothesized partnership that we believe formed the very first complex cells. So it's kind of like the Shakespearean Romeo and Juliet, where two different families of microbes decided to break tradition and live together. Although, wait, in the Shakespearean story, I think they both died. Here though, they didn't. And so I guess the question is, why exactly does this matter? Well, this Australian discovery is a huge deal because it provides the first visual model and actual evidence for how complex life might have started on a primitive Earth. And so even though for a very long time we only had DNA evidence, or basically just some of the genes that we seem to share, now we can physically see the cellular machinery in action and how most of this began. And it also confirms that life didn't just evolve through competition, but in most cases through extremely complex cooperation. And so without this specific microbial marriage, complex life as we know it would have never existed. Although naturally where this happened is of course currently unknown. But based on some of the other studies, we might start making some conclusions based on what's been discovered in a lot of extreme environments on the planet. So this is not the only study on the evolution of life and the beginning of complex life, with some of the other recent research investigating at least 2 potential places where all this could have begun, with the 2 most likely locations being either the deep-sea hydrothermal vents or possibly land-based hot springs. So for example, at least one recent study discovered that minerals called iron sulfides inside of these hot springs seem to trigger chemical reactions that produce methanol, one of the main building blocks of life, which obviously provides a kind of a link between geochemistry and early biology. And so here when it comes to the cradle of complex life on Earth, a lot of research points at some of the most extreme environments with high pressure and high temperature, such as the previously mentioned Loki's Castle, with many of these systems providing all of the essential ingredients for a prebiotic chemistry: heat that drives complex chemical reactions, minerals that are needed for the development, and longevity in a sense that many of these systems can remain active for thousands or even millions of years. But more intriguingly, at least one other study even suggests that many of these locations could have started naturally as a result of asteroid impacts. Or basically when a very large rock hits the planet, because it creates intense heat and intense pressure, it can actually form hydrothermal systems in the crater that possibly last for thousands of years, which does give molecules plenty of time to organize into complex structures, and once again provides all of the necessary conditions for life to start evolving. But once again, when it comes to these types of explanations, right now this is still very hypothetical. In other words, it's mostly based on mathematical models and theoretical predictions, not actual physical observations. Nevertheless, a lot of this research strengthens the theory that first of all life seems to be a kind of a natural byproduct of planetary geology and chemistry, and can emerge in dark pressurized depths in various oceans, which is of course great news for astrobiology, because we might be able to find something similar in places like Enceladus and Europa, but it also tells us that the path to complex life is usually paved with collaboration, because these tiny Asgard microbes in Shark Bay remind us that even the smallest partners can eventually completely change the history of the planet. And so in essence, you and I are literally the result of a 2 billion-year-old friendship between 2 very unlikely species, a tiny microbe and some kind of an unusual archaea. And so what you're seeing here is not just some kind of a rock or some kind of a slime. This is literally an ancient home of the ancestors that made our existence possible. The universal phenomenon, something like this might have happened elsewhere. But importantly, we now have actual physical evidence that this is probably how complex life began. But on that note, if you want to find out more about Asgard Archaea or some of the other discoveries from the last few years, check out some of the previous videos in the description. We'll definitely come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos, but until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye-bye.
Well, the end of the world.
An enemy has been slain.
Got a challenge for you. Any good fishing spots around here? Who wants a piece of the chair?
They can run.
Go for a boiled egg right about now. Sky looks mighty
Your
free.
turret has been destroyed.
You're welcome.
Shut down. Legendary.
Old man with a lamp.
Okay, let's start this video with this somewhat bizarre picture of a Japanese crab. This is known as the Hikigani or the Hikani crab, whose shell surprisingly resembles a very angry samurai. And though according to the local folklore, this is basically the result of certain Japanese warriors being reincarnated as crabs, the scientific reality is that it's quite likely that the fishermen that catch these crabs release them back into the sea, allowing these bizarre crabs to survive, while other crabs end up being eaten. And well, we've discussed this in one of the previous videos on how humans seem to be actually influencing the evolution of various animals on the planet, because this is a pretty good example of what scientists refer to as bioevolutionary Anthropocene hypothesis. The idea that human activity is now one of the most important, if not the most important, imprints on the evolution of life itself, which basically makes humans, or I guess you and me, a kind of a hyper-keystone species, accidentally reshaping life as it evolves. And though in that previous video we've discussed quite a few interesting examples, a recent study actually presented us with a new one from New Zealand, a long-tailed stonefly. Something that used to be dark because it was trying to mimic a toxic neighbor so that basically birds would not eat it, but because of a major deforestation in the area, a lot of these toxic neighbors have now disappeared, and in just a few centuries, a lot of stoneflies evolved to now be much lighter, because this helps them hide in a slightly different way. They basically now blend in with the rocks. But today we're going to discuss something that's a little bit closer to us. What about humans? Or basically, what about human evolution? And the thing is, there is a common misconception that human evolution possibly stopped once we developed modern civilization. But the evidence from the last few decades suggests otherwise. It almost suggests the opposite. The evolution has not stopped, and it's possibly even accelerating. Which is precisely what we're going to be discussing in this video, focusing on some of the recent studies that essentially find definitive evidence of humans evolving in some really bizarre ways. And so let's start with one of the older studies from 2015. This one is from Argentina, and specifically the Argentinian Andes. And that's because here a small population living in a certain region, and specifically close to the town of San Antonio de los Cobres, the location where people lived for several thousand years, was actually discovered to drink water containing approximately 20 times the recommended level of arsenic, a naturally occurring metalloid notorious for its toxicity, mostly because it usually interferes with the cellular metabolism and prevents certain enzymes from forming. As a matter of fact, it's sort of even known as the king of poisons, because it's potent, odorless, tasteless, and kills without anyone ever finding out. Okay, don't get any ideas from this. But yeah, in many locations it's still used as a rat poison. And so here in this study on human adaptation to arsenic-rich environments, researchers first confirmed that a lot of water here contains 20 times the recommended limit of arsenic, something that normally would actually cause severe illness or death in most people. Yet none of the people living here showed any symptoms, which intrigued the scientists behind the study, who then basically performed a DNA analysis and a DNA comparison between the population living in the region and everyone else. And turns out that they carry a unique variant of the AS3MT gene, also known as arsenite methyltransferase. This is something that plays a critical role in detoxifying inorganic arsenic and then helping in its removal. This is normally found in a lot of different tissues, such as in, for example, liver, and is crucial for removing arsenic from our bodies. But here this is the first significant evidence that there seems to be a specific human adaptation to survive in these toxic conditions and to have a gene that's slightly more effective compared to everyone else. And so here the population living in the Mina de Atacama that relied on this groundwater for thousands of years was actually consuming a naturally contaminated high level of arsenic water that would probably kill most of us in just a few weeks. But their gene seems to be exceptionally efficient at converting arsenic and then removing it from the tissue. But moreover, they confirmed that a lot of these genetic variants seem to be much more common to the Andean population, especially groups living in Peru and Colombia. So this confirms a kind of a natural selection that seems to have lasted for several thousand years. And so this discovery is considered to be the first evidence of human adaptation to toxic chemicals. And while humans have evolved to, for example, survive in other harsh conditions such as very high altitude or even very high UV radiation, this shows that our genomes can also adapt even in chronic exposure to lethal substances if given enough generations. But this is not the only water-related adaptation that has been previously explored in various studies. Here, a slightly different population living in a completely different location have actually adapted to lack of water or so-called chronic dehydration. And this is based on a slightly different study from the Turkana people in northwest Kenya. This is actually one of the most recent studies. And so here these people adapted to a diet that would actually make most of us very sick. Up to 80% of their diet consists of animal products like milk, meat and fat, but also extremely low consumption of water. And turns out that they actually carry a specific variant of STC1 gene that helps their kidneys handle a lot of high protein intake and chronic dehydration, with this gene basically acting as a kind of a survival gene by helping the kidneys retain more water and reducing the fluid lost during urination. While at the same time, surprisingly, it also protects the kidneys from damage that's usually caused by very high salt concentrations and a lot of waste products, especially when dehydrated. In other words, by living in the driest landscapes, they developed another genetic adaptation that most likely evolved over almost 100,000 years. That's because these people lived here for a very long time. But interestingly, when they actually moved to cities and changed their diet, they experience a kind of an evolutionary mismatch. Or basically their bodies go through a major crash. And in most cases, the Turkana people unfortunately end up with various metabolic diseases because their genes are still tuned for their ancestral lifestyle. So having what we would call a healthy diet for them turns out to be actually dangerous. But when it comes to water, there's another intriguing adaptation from, once again, a different region. This was initially reported back in 2018, but has been also studied in the last few years by other scientists. And here we have these so-called sea nomads, more officially known as the Bajau people, a tribe of people living in Southeast Asia who lived on the sea for over 8,000 years. And they're basically famous for their extraordinary free diving abilities. And so here several studies discovered that the Bajau have genetically enlarged spleens, which end up providing a lot of oxygen when they go on their deep dives. And that actually allows most of them to dive up to about 70 meters in depth, mostly because their spleen seems to be at least 50% larger than everyone else on Earth. And that actually allows them to survive hypoxia, or low oxygen conditions, and stay underwater for an extremely long time. Surprisingly though, this is also present in Bajau that don't even dive, or basically people that kind of choose to stay on the surface, which means that this is not something that's developed by diving, but does involve a heritable genetic component and not just a physical response to training. And in this case, this confirms that the spleen acts as a kind of a biological scuba tank, contracting and injecting a boost of oxygenated red blood cells into the circulatory system. And because Bajau have a much larger spleen, they can stay underwater extremely long, sometimes even exceeding 10 minutes. And so in the study, scientists identify at least two genes, PDE10A and BDKRB2, that seem to be slightly different in this particular population. One of them is responsible for the hormonal control, which then regulates the spleen size, and one of them seems to affect the human dive reflex, and even controls various blood vessels by helping them constrict better. And so once again, this proves that humans are still undergoing significant localized evolution, mostly in response to their environment. But we even have studies on something that's a lot more common and seems to affect most of us, especially people using a lot of monitors and a lot of screen time. Because here scientists discovered that a lot of us are now being evolved as a result of light conditions. And that's because for millions of years our ancestors were mostly active during the day and slept during nighttime, which eventually created the now ingrained 24-hour body clock, the circadian rhythm. But we live in a society where there is a lot of artificial light that's now decoupling us from that rhythm. And so in this recent publication by Mike Lee, that you can find in the description, explores the idea of how light has been a primary architect, especially in the modern environment. Or basically how light is now creating artificial pressure that's forcing our eyes to adapt. Now we know that light generally played a major role in evolving different hairstyles and skin types. It's now doing something entirely different for our biological rhythms. And so here it was discovered that genes associated with myopia or short-sightedness have now become extremely common in just the last 25 years. Mostly because we spend a lot less time in natural sunlight, which causes our eyes to physically change at an extremely fast rate. And so even though artificial light allows us to work at night, unfortunately our bodies have not caught up. This disrupts our natural cycles and marks a very striking example of rapid evolutionary change that pretty much most of us are experiencing today. With the conclusion being that we're still basically the creatures of the light. So even though we use technology and artificial light to kind of liberate ourselves, our biology is still being actively sculpted by our relationship with natural light, which is of course something that most of us do not consider. And last but not least, there's another study that focuses on a slightly different problem. Or essentially it focuses on something referred to as cultural inheritance. Or basically problems that we usually solve much faster than nature or biology can by itself. And scientists refer to this as cultural preemption, basically using technology or advances in, for example, medicine to solve problems that nature did not solve yet. And a classic example here is the cesarean section or C-section. In the past, if a baby was too large and could not be born, it was very often fatal. But today, medical intervention allows those genes to be passed on, increasing the frequency for large-headed babies, and of course, C-sections overall. And this creates a kind of a feedback loop, whereby using technology to shield ourselves, we're becoming increasingly dependent on the technology for survival. And there are lots of examples of this pretty much all around you. Here we basically are sort of rewriting the rulebook of life. And so this type of cultural evolution is now officially outpacing genetic evolution, something that normally takes many generations and is much slower. With researchers arguing that this cultural inheritance is just much more efficient than genetics, at least for the modern population. So for example, developing a vaccine and new farming techniques only takes a few years, and they can spread through population in just one single generation. In contrast, genetic mutations for this would take thousands of years. And if we go to that myopia example, we're obviously solving this problem with glasses. Yep, myopic as well. But this study also suggests that we're now moving from being a species of individuals to a species of groups. Basically similar to how single organisms once evolved into complex multicellular organisms. In other words, there's a kind of a group dependency where the survival depends on the cultural system we belong to. Basically, we now depend on hospitals, schools, the government, and of course technology, without which most of us would probably perish. And this of course forces humans to be more group-oriented and increasingly function like a kind of a superorganism. Kind of like similar to a typical ant colony, where a single ant doesn't really mean much. And so here, a collective success is just much more important than genetic fitness of a single individual. And this of course suggests a major evolutionary transition, signifying a monumental shift in the history of life. Kind of like the transition of animals from water to land. But unfortunately this also creates a very unusual feedback loop. As we become more complex, we start to depend on technology more and more. And that means that we must continue to innovate technologically and even socially just to maintain our current way of life. With the article concluding that the future of humanity may hinge less on our personal biology and more on the strength and adaptability of our societies. Which means that there is a major shift in this idea of survival of the fittest. It's no longer about who has the best genes, but about which group has the best cultural practices. This of course involves technology and social collaboration. And that of course also signals a fundamental shift in what it means to be human. We're definitely being defined by a kind of a collective knowledge now, and not just by individual biology. And so understanding these changes is definitely crucial for our future, and is not just academic. By reflecting on this and by understanding this, it will help us design better medicines, and of course